So as you guys may remember, in the last video I basically lost the scene that I'd created on Maple Small, and as I was following the tutorial, and as soon as I clicked on the buttons to suggest we wanted to play the game without the character, the scene completely dropped away from my view. And even though I put this note in the chapter, unfortunately no one's come back to me yet. So I had to do the most painful thing and go back into the scene, and the only way around it that I know of, that I could find, other than trying to click home on the FN keys on my keypad, which didn't work, is to basically scroll around like a ninny and use my mouse wheel. So eventually I found the edge of the image, and which looks like the Z, Y and X axis but from a distance, and kind of moved around a bit until I saw it, and then painfully had to zoom in. I was zooming in for about 30 minutes to try and get the scene back. So that's the only way to resolve. So if you are following this tutorial, unfortunately that's the only way I found to get this back after I followed the tutorial you're about to see. So I'm going to head back to the same tutorial and try and get back to the same point. So bear with me. So I was following this. Let's see where we are.
Let's take a look at events and functions. I'm going to for you if this check mark appears. So now what happens is on begin play, my screen is going to say hello. I'm going to minimize this a little bit.
So that's about the best part of the chapter that we did in the last one, just before I lost the scene. So hopefully when you get to this bit in this video and you're watching this, this is the bit that you probably need to skip, and I'll pause it when you need to skip it so that you don't fall into the same trap.
I'm going to click on cross here, go to the world settings, and make sure here in the override game mode that Serena is also applied here. Now let's click up on play again, and you can see my screen says hello. Add the player base. Remember,
right, that was the bit you needed to skip.
And we can add one as well, just so we don't fall through the ground. So going here in the quickly add button, going to basic, and adding this player start. So this is where we can start here, and if you world settings, and make sure here in the override game mode that Serena is also applied here. Now let's click up on play again, and you can see world settings, and make sure here in the override game mode that Serena is also.
So at that point when he clicks play is the bit that you lose that scene in the background, the map itself. So don't press play when he says it, but follow the next step.
So applied here. Now let's click up on play again, and you can see my screen says hello. No. I'm falling through the ground. You can see here I'm falling through the ground because I don't have a player start, and we can add one as well, just so we don't fall through the ground. So going here in the quickly add button, going to basic.
So add button. There we go. So add basics.
To place it in my world here. So going here in the quickly add button, going to basic, and adding this player start.
So add basic player start. Push the wrong button. Basic player start. If you remember back to when I first started, I did make my map slightly different. He did say that you could do that. Just making sure I've got the same things ticked. Select mode, player start, select mode, player start. Mine looks different somehow. No, I think it's fine. Right.
So this is where we can start here, and if you click on G, you can remember to show and hide the icons.
GG.
So this is the player start. I am going to place it in my world here at, let's do the Y0, so it's here in the front. And then I'm going to make it smaller right now, because if this capsule is in the middle of your collision tiles, it's going to say bad size. I'm going to reduce the scale down here to 0.25, 0.25, 0.25, and then
So it's in details with the player start selected, and then 0, and then 0 to 5. Right, so my player's start is now back on the screen. Now I've mastered. Where's the grid gone? So if I move around the side, what does that do? I'm behind. So let's just pull that this side. Where's he gone now? Oh, come on. Right, I'm now in front of the map again. We'll move up, down, left, right, and then green towards the map. No idea. Right, let's try and get back to the video.
Then I'm just going to drag it down here close to the ground. Now when we click on play, you can see we're falling through the ground, but we're not falling all the way because we have our collision. Okay, so back to the blueprints now. We said hello, and you can see here to the top left that it says hello on my screen. So the code is working right now, and it's going through this player base.
Right, so I don't know what happened there. I'm not falling through the map, which is good. So let's stop that. Back to the video then.
Other events that we have is something called event tick. So you can search for it here. If you right click in the graph, as I told you before, you can search for it here. And if you just write event, you can see all of the events that we can apply to our code. For example, event hit.
So back on player base, right click, event, tick. Oh, event hit, sorry. Delete, right click, event, hit.
Or if your actor begins overlapping something, or if your character has jumped, you want to do something maybe. If you begin playing the game, this is what we have right now. And maybe this one called event tick, this is what I want to show right now. So this one is something.
Oh man, it was event tick. I heard him right. I was just looking at what was on the screen. So event tick.
That you should never use. And whenever you use it, this is probably because you have to use it at some point, but try to avoid this. Never use it in your game. And what I mean by that is because this one runs your code 60 times per second. So if I click on Control X to copy this and Control V to paste it down here, if I connect this here to the event tick, you can see here when I click on play, this plays so many times, and it plays 60 times per second. So you can imagine if you have some code that is being played 60 times per second, your game is going to lag. And if you have multiple of those, your game is going to lag even more and the players will feel the lag. So try to never use this. There is always a better solution than using an event tick. So I'm going to delete this one. I never use it in my games. And there are some times where you have to use it, but this is whenever your game is very large and you get into a situation where you actually can't do anything else than doing this. But I would say a very large game uses this only one time. So never use this, try to delete it, don't even think about this event. And as you can see, there are a lot of functions that you can add to your game. We have data tables, we have groom, we have layers, and so on. So a lot of things that you can add. You probably will use 10% of all of this. So don't even worry about all of this, even though it looks overwhelming. Again, if I go here and write print string, there are another function called delay. So I can delay here if I write delay. And then we can delay by 2 seconds, for example, and then we can print another string. And here I'm going to call it finished, something like that. And you can click on this arrow to
Right, so let's get that in. So let's delete what he said, because that was useless. Let's pull this one out and go delay. It didn't work. Delay. 2 seconds. And the next one was print string again. Finished. Finished. In string. Finished.
To make it play longer, for example, I want to play it for 10 seconds on my screen. I want to make the color red. So you have some variables here that you can change, and
I missed a point there, so
play by 2
delay.
seconds, for example, and then we can print another string, and here I'm going to call it finished, something like that. And you can click on this arrow to make it play longer. For example, I want to play it for 10 seconds on my screen. I want to make the color red. So you have some variables here that you can change, and I'm going to compile. Remember to do that, and then you can click on play on your game. You can say it says hello, and after 2 seconds it's going to say finished. So very basic. This is Blueprint. You can see it is very easy to work with.
So I don't think I need to change anything there. I will copy what he says, because otherwise I get stuck in the next video. Red. Press OK. Let's tidy this up a little bit. So no doubt this map is going to get, this string of code is going to get big later. So cool. Let's compile, save. Probably saved anyway, but there you go.
And once you learn the basics, you can create very powerful games. So now in the player base, let's actually delete everything, compile and save, and let's move on. Before we continue setting up the character, let's talk about the last thing called variables. And this is the main principle in programming, in Blueprints, and whatever language you are writing.
Just noticed that his location on the Dragon Road is 10. I'm just going to double check mine. So map, Dragon, nope, not going to change it.
To the player base again, and to the left, as you saw before, there is something called variables. And I want you to think of variables as containers that contain some sort of information. They can, for example, contain how much health your character has, what type of weapon your character is holding, your movement speed, whether you have coins enough to buy an item in the shop or not. So a container that contains how many coins you have. So variables are containers that contain specific information, whatever information you are trying to store. And to create a variable, you have to click on this plus button. And when you create a variable, you have to give it a name. And to the right, you can see all the type of variables. Let's, for example, create a boolean. And let's call this boolean has weapon. And I usually start my booleans with a B. And this is because this is usually what's done in C.
So back to player base. I notice he hasn't got his map open in this one, but there you go. Right. Boolean. B has weapon. Obviously, yeah, I need to delete all of these. Delete. Right, okay. And when you drag this out, you can drag it into the event graph. And when you let go, you can either choose to get this variable or to set it to something specific. So let's just get this variable. So now we have this variable, and if you compile, you can see here down in the details panel, you have some settings that you can change for it. You can change the variable type, you can change the name that we just set, you can add a description, and replication we are going to just drag that over. Get weapon.
To touch that later on. This is multiplayer. And now it says, please compile the blueprint. And we are going to compile up here, and it's going to show you what the default value is. So what a boolean is something that can be either true or false. So it can be either false like this, or I can tick it and the default value will be true. For example, we can check if the player has the weapon or not. and we can maybe start by default
I'm just going to compile that
being false, so the player does not have the weapon, but later on when the...
So click on that, compile. Yeah, right. There's weapon, default value. Cool.
The player picks up the weapon. This one we are going to set to true.
Okay, let's tick that. Compile, and then it saves. Alright.
Okay, so for example, let's take an example here. Let's do the begin play event again. So if you write begin play, clicking on here. Now, let us take this and we can say print string. Now when
Print string.
we print the string, what you can do instead of saying hello, you can drag this and plug it in here, and it's going to tell you I'm going to convert this boolean variable into a string, because a string is actually a variable as well. You can see here there is a variable called string. So you can drag this and it's going to convert it into a string, which just means into text, and I'm going to print this text to the screen. So now when you plug the variable in, you can now click on play, and it's going to say false. This is the value of the boolean. So later on, let's say after 5 seconds, so I'm going to do the delay node.
So has weapon, like, so just plug that in there.
And do 5 seconds. So after 5 seconds, I actually want to say the character has picked up the weapon. So I can drag this and then say set. I can connect it here and set it to true. And now let's just do the print string again. So I'm going to click on Control C, Control V.
I'm assuming you just did this. Let me just have a bit of a play. So drag that there and set, and then plug that into there. So let's tidy this up. And then he says has weapon, which is tick. He plugs that into another place, print string.
Here, and I am going to connect my variable now, the value, and I'm going to print that to the screen. I'm going to compile and click.
Okay, print string, plug that into there, that into there.
Click on play, so it's going to say false, and after 5 seconds, it's going to say true up here, okay? So it's going to say false, and then it's going to say true, because we set this to true later on. And this is how we set variables dynamically. So when the player later on walks into a weapon, we are going to set the has weapon to true, for example. So let's delete all of this for now. So we have this boolean that can be either true or false, and you can check things with it. You have the other ones, you have a byte, you have an integer, integer 64, and a float. all of these four are numeric values. So for example, let's try to create an integer. Let's drag it out. Again, click on get. Instead of clicking on get and set all the time, you can click and drag and hold Control on the keyboard. This will get it automatically. You can also hold Alt on the keyboard and click and drag, and it will set this automatically. So instead of dragging and clicking on get and set, you can either hold Control or Alt. Okay, so all of these numeric values, so the integer 64, the float, the byte, all of these are numeric values. And if I compile and I click on this here, you can see it is a number. It takes a number in. And this one, we could maybe change the name of it. Click on F2 to change the name. And this one could say amount of coins. So maybe we are collecting coins. And I'm going to compile. It says, please compile the blueprint. Compiling. And here you can see the amount of coins. So we start with 0. And as we walk into coins, we are going to add coins into this variable. So we have some operators. And if you click and drag from this, you can actually say, for example, plus. And you can say we can add coins. If you write minus, you can subtract coins. If you write the divided sign, you can see it says divide. And we also have the multiply like this. So for example, you can say plus like this. And in MapleStory, you can collect the coins. I believe it's called mesos or misos. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what it's called. So let's just call it coins. And for example, I can add, every time I walk into it, I can add 10 coins like this. And now if I just drag from here and write print string, now I can connect this to my print string, and it's going to convert the integer to a string, which is a text variable. And now it's going to print out 10. So let me just make the duration a lot more here. Let me make the color red like this, compile, save. And when I click on play, you can see it says 10 up here because I have 10 coins. So the integer, very cool. You can write numbers. We can use these operators to modify these variables. And another variable type is the float, very important one. We can say, for example, player health. This is what we can call it. We can drag it out, holding Control, getting it automatically out here. So if you compile now, the cool thing about a float compared to an integer is that a float can hold decimal places. So for example, I can write 50.5 here in the default value. As for the coins, if I try to write decimal places, for example, 50.5, it's going to convert it automatically to 50 because you can't write decimal places inside of an integer. So whenever you want a number with decimal places, you have to select a float. This is the only one. But if you want something that is a full number without decimal places, you can choose an integer, or something that is larger, an integer 64. As for the byte, you can only set the number. If I change the variable here, as for the byte, you can only change the number to a maximum of 255. So for the player health now, it's a byte. Again, if I write decimal places, it's not going to accept it. It's only the float that accepts decimal places. And this one can only hold the number 200 up to 255. So if I write 256, it's going to change it to 255. So I can write any number beneath 255. But if I write something above, it's not going to accept it. So you can imagine the uses of these. For example, if I have a character selection screen and I have, let's say I have maybe 60 hairstyles in MapleStory, I can use the byte. But if I have, let's say someday I have 600 hairstyles for some reason, I cannot use a byte anymore because I can only have up to 255 hairstyles. Okay, so these are the numeric values, and we also have other values. We have the name, the string, the text. And as for the name, let's create that. And if I drag the name out here, you can see every single variable that we create have different colors. So if I just create random variables up here, and I change this one to a string, change this one to a text, text, and we can drag those out. We can, for example, call this one achievement ID. We can call the second one server name, and we can call the last one chat message. Okay, so the difference between these, you can try to compile, and you can see when you click on these variables, it is just some text that you can write here. The same goes for the server name, and the same goes for the player health, or this, not the player health, actually we need to compile, not compile, this is the wrong one. I'm going to drag this one instead. And you can see here this achievement ID, it says none right now. So all of them are text variables, and you can write some type of text over here. The difference between those is you always have to choose this name variable whenever you have some sort of text that never changes in game. For example, achievement ID, maybe an achievement that you have is called ID 273 or whatever random number you have. So this ID, you will never have the need to change it in game, and this is where you can use a name, because whatever you write here can never be modified in game. But this is not the case with the server name. So for example, if I write Maple Story best server join now, or something like that, now this text that I write here, you are able to modify it. For example, an example I can give you is a server name. So if the player writes this as the server name, you can actually modify the text that the player writes here. So if you drag from this string variable, and if you just write string, you can see all of the functions that you can use with the string. If you scroll up, you can see this is the category called string. And in here, you have all the functions that you can use with this string. So for example, you can check if the written text here is empty. So if the variable is empty, and if it is empty, you can see the red one, remember, it's actually a Boolean. So it can be either true or false. So for example, if the server name is empty, you're going to give an error to the player telling him or her to write a server name because you can't create an empty server name. We can drag out again, we can write string and we can check again. For example, you can make all the characters to lowercase or to uppercase, or you can even split the text. And maybe what I use it for is if the player writes a bad word, for example, the N word, and I don't want the player to write that in the player name, I can drag here and I can say find, and there is something here in the string called find substring, and I can write the N word. I don't really want to do that here on the video, and it's going to find that word inside of the player server. So whatever the player has written here, it's going to find that word, and if it does, you can do something with it, and in that case we can use the one called replace. So we can replace, also we can just do that instead, find a substring, we can also do that. So replacing the N word with something else, and you can just leave it empty and it will actually replace it with nothing, which means it deletes the word and it doesn't put anything inside of here. Very cool stuff. You can modify the string variables as you wish, but you can't do that here. If you drag from this and you write name, you can see in the name you don't have much that you can do. So you don't have the is empty, you don't have the replace, so you can only modify strings and not the name variable. The last thing you have is the text, and the only thing I want to say about this differently from the string is that a text you can localize, so you can translate it into different languages. Let's say you want to translate your game into German or into Japanese or into Chinese. Whatever text you want to translate, you have to use a text variable. Whatever you write in a string variable, this cannot be translated later on in the game. So before you start making your game, think about, do I want to translate my game into German when I'm finished? If I want to, whatever text you want to translate, you have to write it into a text variable. So as for the server name, I don't think we need to translate server name. For example, let's say we have finished our game. It doesn't really make sense to translate a server name. This is just whatever the player writes. But as for a chat message, let's say, for example, someone says, hello, how are you? Or maybe an NPC is saying that. And now we want to translate this message into Japanese because someone from Japan needs to see what this means. So we are going to change this into Japanese. But if you write this here into here, you can't translate it. You have to write it into a text variable. And then you might ask, why are we not just using this all the time? Why do we even have to use this or this? And this is for optimization. The name uses less memory, and then comes the string, and the one that is most expensive is the text. Of course, it's not going to affect anything if you just use one or two in your game, but if you have a large game you have been working on for 3 years and you only use this all the time, of course it's going to affect your game. So this one uses the least amount of memory, so always try to go with this if you have text that never changes. For example, an achievement ID, but use a string after that. And for example, you can also use it for a player name, because the player name, again, you have to modify the name. If they write a bad word, you have to check for it in their name. And as the last thing, if you want your game to be translated and you have some text that needs to be translated, then you have to write it into a text variable. Alright, so enough about those. Let's delete this for now. And again, you can create more variables, and the last ones we have are the vector, rotator, and transform. We can use this later in the project. I'm not going to cover this for now, but for the vector, very simple. If you just create it right now and click on compile, you can see it comes with 3 numbers. And usually what we use a vector for, we usually use it here. If you click on anything here, you can see in the location, we usually use a vector to change or check for a location, because the location has 3 numbers. And we usually use vectors for that because it has 3 numbers. For example, we can set the character's location whenever they take a portal. We can set it to a specific location. The same goes with the rotator. If I change it to a rotator, it has 3 values, just like here in the details panel. Whenever you click on anything, they have a rotation. So this is a rotator, and you can set or get a rotation. And as the last thing, you have a transform. And this is used whenever you are spawning things into the world. So for example, you are spawning the character into the map, then you have to set the character's location where you want to spawn the character, what rotation the character should have, and the scale that the character should have. Alright, so these were the most important variables, and I'm going to delete all of them. We are going to create more custom variables, and I want to cover these very basic ones to begin with, because this will make it very easy for you later on. So I'm going to delete everything here. Let's compile now. And let's move on to setting up the character, and you will learn all of this step by step during this course.
Okay, so that's what should have been part 5, and that is more informative than anything. So we are on to variables, which I'll do in part 6. So that was events and functions, just basically going over what we can do with the pay strings. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned for part 6.
Know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my seat. Know that they ride or die.